So I'm going to make a short video about what the word slave actually means. If we go by definition, the first thing we will notice is the being a slave means being owned by someone. But there are a lot of misconceptions about this. First off, for most of history, owning slaves was something only a very small part of the population could do, generally around 1% or such. Even in worst case scenario would never be beyond 10%, but generally would be around 1% or less, or much less. Okay, so that would be first. Second would be that slaves, unlike what you see in a lot of movies and anime or others, they were not cheap. Yeah, there was the case for certain slaves, like the African slaves or the slaves from Islamic countries, but even then, you can't say that they were cheap. And the reason is very simple. Human beings do not, unlike what other people that hate humans want to tell you, that call us cancer, do not reproduce so fast. So even if you have someone that, I don't know, just you have, let's say, women that don't do jack shit except making babies from 15, 16 to 40, let's say, you still can't make a lot of babies. I mean, you have 24 years, and even then there's like 24 divided by 3. You can technically make at most 8 children if you don't, because you have to breastfeed and stuff like that, and you generally would not unless you have twins and such, you would not have more. Of course there are cases when you have more, but well, those are exceptions. You generally don't have so many kids, and many do not even survive in post a pre-industrial age. That's why, for instance, in England, being the 7th child and managing to reach adulthood not only seemed extremely unlikely, but being the 7th child was considered to have magical powers, something like that, because it seemed almost impossible. So yeah, having a lot of children, not something so easy to do. So you cannot have a lot of slaves, even if you go to other countries. And people knew that. I mean, they were not stupid, and they were not like and most of them were not maniacs. Well, Muslims were and still are, but that's another big issue. So you had to take care of your slave. You bought a slave that was extremely expensive, and you have to take care of it. That meant that you have to pay for food. Slave had to be well fed. I wouldn't say that you had to feed him expensive food, but you couldn't. It was not a good idea to have it to starve, because then you would lose a lot more money, and you would not want to. You have to provide shelter, you have to provide clothing, you have to provide some extra money for, I don't know, maybe booze or stuff like that, because here's the thing: if you do not provide for all this, your slave will either rebel, die, or try to escape, and you don't want either of those. So you basically had to pay a lot of money for the slave. Basically there was a sum of money you'd pay every month for the welfare of your slave. Also, you have to pay for medicine if your slave got sick. So again, another important thing to know is that being a slave didn't mean that you'd work 24/7. You would work generally from morning to the evening with some break at lunch. You would also have days off, especially Sunday and Saturday. You would also have during the holidays days off, and depending on case, you could also be paid enough to make a fortune. Also, not all slaves were forced to be slaves. Some slaves chose to be slaves. Basically, you would have people that would sell themselves into slavery to earn a certain amount of money, because believe it or not, being a slave meant you generally got paid. And being a slave was seen for most of the ancient times as a way to pay a debt to the slave owner. Now, the debt could be extended to multiple generations, and of course, many slave owners made it so that basically it was extremely hard to, if not impossible, to actually pay your debt. And of course there were abuses, but in any situation there are abuses. Okay, and you would not kept chains on them, because they'll not be able to do work very efficiently. There were cases, most chains were put when you had them have tools that could be used as weapons, or you had very the strong and dangerous people that were slaves, and you're afraid that they might basically kill you. So again, those are the situations you would have changed. Otherwise, you would not have changed on slaves, but you would have a way to identify them, either by a certain paper or a tattoo. Generally, because you would have to, if there's always the problem if someone might kill your slave or steal your slave or stuff like that, and you would not want this. Another thing about slavery is most people do not understand, is that again, you would have a certain amount of freedom, and there were slaves that would actually get to higher positions. There were slaves that actually made fortunes as slaves, and so on. So there are a lot of types of slaves, and then the question that arises is what differentiates a slave from a free person. Well, there are a number of things that differentiated slaves from free people. You could, in some countries, was owning property, but that wasn't something generic. Generally, as a slave, you could own property. Of course, if you try to pay a debt, the first thing you do most often you would be selling all your possessions before reaching the state of a slave. So a lot of them didn't have property, but for instance, if you sell them yourself, or someone sold yourself into slavery or something like that, you could have property. Also, let's say you manage to gather enough money, you could get property and say, okay, I just want to remain a slave. Sounds weird, right? Until I get more money and so on. Now, again, what makes a slave and makes it different from other workers? And my answer is this: a slave is and was paid based on the amount of time it worked. A free person was paid based on the result of their work. For instance, if you had two slaves and one slave, let's say, gathered like 10 ballots of cotton, and one gathered 20 ballots of cotton, you would not pay the slave that carried 20 buckets of cotton twice the money. You would pay them the exact same, the minimum amount you were requested to pay. Basically, the amount they had to, the minimum amount they have to gather. It also force the slave to gather as much as possible, because, and you'd pay that amount regardless of how much they gathered. On the other hand, if you had a free worker, a person that would work for free, you would pay generally based on the amount of work they done, basically of how much they gathered. Of course, there was something between slaves and at the middle ground between a free person and a slave, which basically meant you would work, sell your time, just as a slave. And you can see this even in the Bible. You see the workers said, okay, no one hired us for the day. But here's the thing. In the case of people that were free but worked by the hour or something like that, they would not be, let's say, employed at the same person for a long period of time, and they would not have, let's say, like a contract. Okay, you work for me for 2-3 years or something like that. They would be employed for a few hours maybe, or a day, and most often than not you would be paid, still paid related to the amount of work that can be done in that amount of time. So you'd still be close to a free man. Now, why did I want to specify that the main difference is the fact that slaves are paid for the amount of time they spend? Is because most people today are slaves. Doesn't matter, because if you are working on a wage, basically you are paid by the hour, even if the pay comes at the end of the month or twice a month or once a year or whatever. If you are paid by the hour, you can see that on your pay, or are a salary man, then you are a slave. I'm sorry, but you are a slave, and you have to understand that regardless if your money you earn very much from your job or you earn very little, you are a slave. You are paid the minimum amount the employer can get away with, regardless of how much they work. They will be forced to work as much as possible for that money, and so on. Of course, since it's a form of slavery where you choose you choose your own owner and you choose to be a slave, we're somewhat choose, because of course you have the possibility to do something else that, I don't know, like fix cars or make baskets or whatever and sell them. Most people choose this, and for this there are a number of obligations from both sides. So again, it seems a bit more free than regular slaves. But I'm going to say this: for the 8 hours you spend at work, which is huge, it's a huge amount of time. Basically, all your day is spent at work. Okay, so you work just as a slave. The slave didn't work even less, I would say. Okay, you are forced to be under the control of your boss. He decides when you go to eat. He decides when you go to the bathroom. He decides where you sit, what you do, and so on. Because otherwise you get fired. Okay, so he owns you for that time. He can also sell you to someone else. It's called outsourcing, right? So you are a slave. Doesn't matter if you don't feel like it, but you are a slave in that case. And that's what I wanted to say. Basically, a wage job is a form of slavery, and with few exceptions, like I don't know, being a waitress or something like that, or piccolo or something like that. I think we should get rid of this type of jobs because they are demeaning. I mean, and it allows certain people to become extremely rich and to keep another type of people under at a certain level where they will never be able to become self-sufficient. Basically, they will always be forced to choose a job where they're treated like slaves. They can never start a business, even a small business. They could never, sell their products instead of their time. And that's all I wanted to say. Bye.